In a cluttered Pennsylvania home, an 78-year-old grandmother was about to confront her family's betrayal. What started as packing for assisted living took a shocking turn when they discovered a childhood suitcase. Elena Rossi wasn't your typical grandmother. For 50 years, she had dedicated her life to rescuing abandoned children, known for ensuring no child faced the isolation she once knew. When her grandchildren began dismantling her life's work, they had no idea they were about to uncover devastating family secrets. Elena's revelation about being abandoned at age 8 would shatter everything they believed about love, loyalty, and family bonds forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The cardboard boxes arrived before her grandchildren did, stacked like tombstones on Elena Rossi's front porch. She watched them through her lace curtains as Marcus and Sophia pulled into the driveway, their movements efficient and purposeful, the kind of choreographed precision that comes from avoiding emotional complexity. Elena settled deeper into her favorite armchair, the one with the faded blue fabric that had witnessed 70 years of conversations, tears, and quiet moments of reflection. Her fingers traced the worn armrest where countless children had perched while she read them stories or helped them process their pain. Now it would be labeled, packed, and either donated or discarded. "Grandma Elena?" Sophia's voice carried through the screen door, tentative and artificially bright. "We're here." "I can see that," Elena replied, her voice carrying the dry wit that had sustained her through decades of bureaucratic meetings and family court hearings. "Unless my eyes have failed along with everything else." Marcus entered first, his suit jacket already discarded, sleeves rolled up with the efficiency of a man accustomed to solving problems through organization and delegation. At 45, he carried himself like someone who had learned early that emotional distance was safer than vulnerability. His eyes swept the living room with the calculating gaze of an appraiser, measuring, categorizing, determining value. "We brought plenty of boxes," he announced, setting down a roll of packing tape with the finality of a gavel. "And we've scheduled the donation pickup for Thursday. The moving truck comes Friday morning." Sophia followed behind him, her movements softer but no less determined. Elena noticed how her younger granddaughter's eyes lingered on the photographs covering every available surface. Dozens of children's faces spanning 5 decades of Elena's work with social services. Some were professional shots from award ceremonies, others were crayon drawings taped to construction paper, all bearing messages of gratitude in childish scrawl. "There are so many," Sophia murmured, picking up a framed photo of Elena receiving the state's Distinguished Service Award. "I had no idea you kept all of these. Why would you?" Elena's response was measured, not accusatory, but it landed with weight nonetheless. "You never asked." Marcus cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the suddenly tense air. "Let's focus on what needs to be done. The facility said you can bring 1 suitcase of personal items and maybe a few photographs. Everything else." He gestured vaguely at the accumulated possessions of a lifetime. "Everything else gets disposed of," Elena finished for him. She watched as he flinched slightly at her choice of words. "That's the word they used, isn't it? When you signed the papers?" "Grandma, that's not," Sophia began, but Elena raised a hand. "I'm not criticizing, dear. I understand the practicalities. I've disposed of things myself when necessary." Her eyes found Marcus's face, studying the way he avoided her gaze. "Though I always tried to be certain it was truly necessary." The morning stretched on with the systematic dismantling of a life's work. Elena watched as Marcus wrapped her grandmother's china in newspaper, the same set that had fed countless foster children over the years, the plates that had held birthday cakes for kids who had never had a proper celebration before. Sophia worked more slowly, reading the thank you notes before placing them in boxes marked for storage. "This one's from 1987, Sophia said, holding up a child's drawing of a rainbow. She wrote, "Thank you for finding me a family, Miss Elena." "Sarah Martinez," Elena said without looking. "She was 7 when her mother overdosed. Lived in 4 different homes before we found the Hendersons. Last I heard, she was finishing her residency in pediatrics." Marcus paused in his wrapping. You remember all of them? The ones who mattered? Yes. Elena's voice softened. Children have a way of marking your heart. Some impressions never fade. The discovery came when Sophia ventured into the attic, following Elena's directions to retrieve the Christmas decorations that needed to be donated. Instead, she found herself staring at a small, battered suitcase pushed far back under the eaves. Brown leather cracked with age, the corners reinforced with what looked like electrical tape. "What's this one?" Sophia called down, brushing dust from the handle. Elena's entire demeanor shifted. Her spine straightened, and her hands gripped the armrests of her chair. "Bring it down here." The suitcase landed on the coffee table with a soft thud, its presence somehow changing the entire atmosphere of the room. Elena stared at it for a long moment, her fingers hovering just above the surface. "I haven't seen this in years," she whispered. "I thought I'd lost it in one of the moves." Marcus looked up from his packing. "What is it?" "My first suitcase." Elena's voice carried an odd mixture of tenderness and pain. "From when I was 8 years old." Sophia sat on the edge of the couch, drawn by something in her grandmother's tone. "When you were 8? But why would you still have?" "Because some things are too important to throw away, even when they hurt to keep." Elena's fingers finally made contact with the leather, tracing the edges with the delicacy of someone handling something sacred. "This suitcase and we traveled quite a journey together." "Grandma," Marcus's voice carried a warning note. "We don't have time for..." "For what?" Elena's eyes snapped to his face, suddenly sharp and challenging. "For stories? For understanding where I came from? For learning why this old woman you're so eager to warehouse might have something worth hearing?" The room fell silent except for the tick of the mantel clock. Another item that would be donated, Elena realized. Marcus's jaw tightened, and Sophia looked between them with the expression of someone trying to prevent an explosion. "I know what it feels like," Elena said quietly, her gaze returning to the suitcase. "To be disposed of. To be seen as inconvenient, burdensome. To have the people who are supposed to love you decide that your life would be better managed by strangers." "That's not what we're doing," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Elena opened the suitcase with careful fingers. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was a child's dress, small enough for an 8-year-old, the fabric faded but still showing traces of a floral pattern. Beneath it lay a folded piece of paper, the edges soft with handling. Sophia leaned forward. "Grandma, what is this?" "This," Elena said, lifting the dress with infinite care, "is what I was wearing the day my mother left me at Millbrook train station, with nothing but this suitcase and a promise that she'd come back when things got better." The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. It was the kind of quiet that comes when the ground beneath familiar assumptions suddenly shifts. "She left you?" Sophia's voice was barely a whisper. Abandoned would be the more accurate term. Elena's words were matter-of-fact, but they carried the weight of decades. July 15, 1962. I stood on that platform watching her train disappear, clutching this suitcase and believing every word she'd told me about coming back. Marcus had stopped packing entirely. "You never told us. You never asked." Elena repeated her earlier words, but now they carried a different meaning. "And perhaps I never found the right way to tell you. But sitting here, watching you both go through my life with such systematic efficiency, I find myself remembering what it felt like to be 8 years old and utterly alone." She pulled out a faded photograph from the suitcase, a black-and-white image showing a young girl standing between a man in a station master's uniform and a woman in a simple dress. The child's face was solemn but not broken, her small hand clasped in the woman's larger one. "Frank and Catherine Morrison," Elena said, seeing Sophia's questioning look. "The people who saved me, who showed me that family isn't always about blood, and that sometimes strangers can offer more love than the people who share your name." Marcus set down the china plate he'd been holding, his movements suddenly uncertain. "Grandma, I don't understand what this has to do with what's happening here today." Elena's smile was sad but knowing. "Oh, my dear boy." It has everything to do with what's happening here today. Marcus's hand tightened around the china plate he'd been holding, the delicate porcelain suddenly feeling fragile enough to shatter with the slightest pressure. The photograph of young Elena with the Morrisons lay on the coffee table between them like evidence in a trial none of them had expected to attend. "You're saying Mom abandoned you at a train station," he said slowly, his voice carrying the careful control of someone trying to process information that didn't fit into his understanding of the world. "When you were 8 years old." "I'm not saying it," Elena replied, her fingers still resting on the edge of the old suitcase. "I'm telling you what happened. There's a difference." Sophia had moved closer, her earlier efficiency forgotten as she studied her grandmother's face for signs of what? Deception? Pain? The comfortable distance she'd maintained all morning had evaporated, replaced by something that felt dangerously like empathy. But why? Sophia's question came out as barely more than a whisper. Why would she do that? Elena's eyes grew distant, as if she were looking through the walls of her living room to something that existed 70 years in the past. It was July 15, 1962, a Tuesday. I remember because Mama had been talking about Tuesday being our new beginning day for weeks leading up to it. The room seemed to shift around them as Elena's voice took on the cadence of someone stepping back through time. Marcus found himself setting the plate down entirely, his systematic packing forgotten. We lived in a boarding house in Pittsburgh then, one room with a hot plate and a sink that barely worked. Mama cleaned offices at night and took in mending during the day, but it was never enough. Never enough food, never enough heat in winter, never enough hope that things would get better. Elena lifted the child's dress from the suitcase, holding it up to catch the afternoon light streaming through her windows. She woke me before dawn that morning and helped me into this dress. My Sunday dress, she called it, though we never went to church. She packed this suitcase with my other dress, my nightgown, and the few books I owned. "She told you that you were going somewhere?" Sophia asked, leaning forward. "She told me we were going to visit family. Distant cousins who lived in a beautiful town with a train station where important people came and went. She said they had a big house and wanted to meet me." Elena's smile was bitter with memory. "I was so excited. I'd never been on a train before." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Grandma, I'm not sure we need to hear." "You need to hear this." Elena's voice cut through his objection with surprising strength. "You need to understand what it means to be abandoned by the people who are supposed to protect you." She stood slowly, her movements careful but determined, and walked to the window that faced the street. The train ride took 3 hours. Mama sat beside me, pointing out farmland and small towns, telling me stories about her own childhood. She bought me a candy bar from the conductor, a luxury we couldn't afford. I thought it was the most wonderful day of my life. The silence stretched as Elena gathered her thoughts, her back still turned to her grandchildren. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of a child's confusion and terror. Millbrook was smaller than I'd expected. Just a tiny station with a wooden platform and a single bench. When we got off the train, Mama carried my suitcase and held my hand tight. She kept looking around like she was searching for something, but I didn't see any relatives waiting for us. Elena turned back to face them, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She knelt down beside me on that platform and pressed a piece of paper into my hand. She told me the cousins were running late, but they'd be there soon. She said I should wait on the bench and not wander off. She said, Elena's voice cracked slightly. She said she had to use the ladies' room and would be right back. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Grandma." I sat on that bench for 2 hours before I realized she wasn't coming back. The afternoon train had come and gone, and I watched her board it through the station window. She looked back once, just once, and I saw her crying. But she didn't get off. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. What did you do? What does an 8-year-old do when her entire world disappears? I opened the note she'd given me. Elena walked back to the suitcase and pulled out the yellowed piece of paper, unfolding it with the reverence reserved for sacred texts. It said, "My dearest Elena, You are the best thing I ever did with my life, but I cannot give you what you deserve. Someone here will help you find a better family than I can be. Wait for them. Be good. I love you more than the moon and stars. Mama." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned for decades. Sophia was crying now, tears sliding down her cheeks as she stared at her grandmother with new eyes. "I sat on that bench until sunset," Elena continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was sharing. "People walked past. Some gave me curious looks, but most ignored me entirely. A few asked if I was waiting for someone, and I told them yes, my cousins were coming. Because that's what I believed. That's what I had to believe." She returned to her armchair, suddenly looking every one of her 78 years. As it got dark, the station master, Frank Morrison, came out to lock up. He found me still sitting there, clutching my suitcase and that note. He read it, looked at me for the longest time, then asked if I was hungry. "He helped you?" Sophia asked. "He saved me," Elena corrected. Frank Morrison was a widower who'd lost his wife, an unborn child, in a car accident 2 years earlier. He had every reason to turn me over to the authorities and let the system handle one more abandoned child. Instead, he brought me into his office, made me a sandwich, and let me sleep on the couch. Marcus found his voice, though it sounded strange to his own ears. For how long? That first night, I thought it would just be until my cousins came. But Frank was smarter than an 8-year-old girl. He knew there were no cousins coming. He knew what abandonment looked like. And he knew I was going to need more than official help to survive it. Elena pulled another photograph from the suitcase. This one showing a man in a station master's uniform standing beside the small wooden platform she'd described. His face was kind but weathered, the expression of someone who'd seen too much loss but hadn't let it harden his heart. Frank taught me about chosen family that first week. He said that sometimes the people who love you most aren't the ones who share your blood. They're the ones who choose to stay when staying is hard. The irony of those words, spoken in a room where her own blood relatives were preparing to move her to assisted living, was not lost on anyone present. "This is all very—" Marcus began, then stopped, his usual confidence deserting him. "Very what?" Elena's eyes sharpened, focusing on his face with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "Very inconvenient? Very irrelevant to our current situation?" "I was going to say very sad," he replied, but his tone suggested he'd been thinking something else entirely. "It was sad," Elena agreed. "Terrifying, actually. Do you know what it feels like to be 8 years old and realize that the person you trusted most in the world has decided you'd be better off without them?" Sophia wiped her eyes, her voice thick with emotion. "Grandma, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Of course you didn't. How could you? I've spent 70 years learning to carry this story without letting it break me. But sitting here today, watching you both handle my life with such clinical efficiency," Elena gestured at the boxes and packing materials surrounding them, "I find myself remembering exactly how it felt to be expendable." The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. "We're not. That's not what we're doing. Isn't it?" Elena's voice was quiet, but it carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades working with families in crisis. "You've made decisions about my future without consulting me. You've determined that my life would be better managed by strangers. You've come here to dispose of the evidence of a lifetime spent helping others, because it doesn't fit into your neat categories of necessary and, quote, unnecessary." She leaned forward in her chair, her gaze moving between both of them. "Tell me, when you signed those papers for Sunset Manor, did you think about what I might want? Or did you decide, like my mother did, that you knew what was best for me?" Marcus stood abruptly, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and something that looked uncomfortably like shame. "That's not fair. We're trying to help you. You can't live alone anymore. The doctor said so. You've fallen twice in the past month. And your solution is to pack me away where I won't be an inconvenience anymore. That's not—" Marcus stopped, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "God, you're impossible. We're trying to do the right thing here." "The right thing for whom?" Elena asked calmly. The question hung in the air between them. unanswered, and unanswerable. Sophia looked between her brother and grandmother, seeing clearly for the first time the parallel Elena was drawing. The resemblance was uncomfortable and undeniable. "What happened next?" Sophia asked quietly. "After Frank found you?" Elena smiled at her younger granddaughter, expression that held both gratitude and sadness. Frank Morrison proved that not all adults abandon children when caring for them becomes complicated. Some choose to step up instead of step away. She pulled the last item from the suitcase, a small, carved wooden train, the paint worn away by decades of handling. "He whittled this for me that first week. Said every station child needed something to remind them that trains don't just take people away. Sometimes they bring them home." Marcus stared at the wooden toy, his expression unreadable. "How long did you live with him?" "Frank kept me at the station for 2 weeks while he figured out what to do. He could have called the authorities immediately, but he knew the foster system. He'd seen what happened to kids who got lost in it. Instead, he contacted his sister-in-law, Catherine Morrison. She was a schoolteacher, unmarried, with a spare bedroom and a heart bigger than her practical sensibilities." Elena's voice softened as she spoke of Catherine. "She didn't want to take me at first. She was 48 years old, set in her ways, and had never planned on raising a child. But Frank convinced her to meet me, and something happened between us. Maybe she saw something in my eyes that reminded her of her own childhood struggles. Maybe she just couldn't turn away from a child in need. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "She adopted you?" Sophia asked. "Informally. There were no official papers. Catherine couldn't afford the legal fees, and my mother had to consent to any adoption. Since no one could find her, I simply became Catherine Morrison's ward. I took her name, attended her school, and learned what it meant to be part of a family that chose to love me." Elena stood again, this time moving to a bookshelf lined with framed photographs. She selected one and brought it back. A graduation photo showing a young woman in a nurse's cap standing beside an older woman with kind eyes. "Catherine put me through nursing school, worked extra hours tutoring other children to pay for my education. She believed that everyone deserves a chance to make something meaningful of their life, regardless of how it began." Marcus was studying his grandmother's face with an expression of dawning recognition. "That's why you became a social worker. That's why I dedicated my life to making sure no child ever felt what I felt on that train station platform. The absolute certainty that you are unwanted, unloved, disposable." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Sophia began crying again, but Marcus's face had gone carefully blank, the expression he wore when emotions threatened to overwhelm his carefully constructed defenses. "Grandma," Sophia said through her tears, "we never meant to make you feel that way." "Intentions matter less than actions," Elena replied gently. "And sometimes the kindest intentions can still lead to the cruelest outcomes. My mother thought she was giving me a better chance at life. You think you're ensuring my safety and care, but the result is the same. I'm being removed from the life I've built and placed somewhere that's more convenient for everyone except me." She sat back down, suddenly looking exhausted. "Frank Morrison could have made the easy choice. He could have handed me over to the proper authorities and gone back to his quiet life. Instead, he chose the complicated path. He chose to see me as a person worth saving rather than a problem to be solved." The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither Marcus nor Sophia seemed ready to face. Outside, the afternoon shadows were growing longer, and the boxes that had seemed so necessary that morning now looked like monuments to their own emotional distance. "What do you want us to do?" Sophia asked finally, her voice small. Elena looked at both of her grandchildren, really looked at them, for the first time since they'd arrived. "I want you to understand that being old doesn't make me a burden. Being vulnerable doesn't make me expendable. And needing help doesn't mean I've stopped being worth the effort it takes to truly care for someone." She picked up the wooden train from the coffee table, turning it over in her weathered hands. "Frank Morrison taught me that family isn't about convenience. It's about choosing to stay when staying is hard. It's about looking for solutions that honor the person, not just solve the problem." Marcus sat down heavily, his corporate efficiency finally cracking under the weight of what he was hearing. "I don't know how to do this, Grandma. I don't know how to be the kind of person who makes the complicated choice." "Then learn," Elena said simply, "the same way I learned to trust again after being abandoned. The same way I learned to love children who'd been thrown away by their families. The same way I learned that healing is possible, even from the deepest wounds." She placed the wooden train back in the suitcase but left the lid open. "This is my story, but it doesn't have to be the end of our story. We can choose differently. We can break the cycle of abandonment that's been passed down through generations like a curse." Elena looked directly at Marcus, her eyes holding both challenge and hope. "The question is, are you brave enough to try?" Marcus sat in stunned silence, the wooden train's significance settling over him like a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the room filled with the remnants of Elena's life. Sophia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her earlier efficiency replaced by something raw and uncertain. "I need some air," Marcus said abruptly, standing and walking toward the front door. But instead of leaving, he stopped on the threshold, his hand gripping the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Elena watched him with the patient eyes of someone who had spent decades observing people in crisis. "Running away doesn't change what you've heard, Marcus. I'm not running away." His voice was tight, controlled. "I'm trying to process the fact that you've never told us any of this before. And I'm trying to understand," Sophia said, her voice stronger now despite the tears, "why you think our situation is the same." "We're not abandoning you, Grandma. We're trying to keep you safe." Elena's laugh was soft but bitter. "That's exactly what my mother told herself. That she was giving me a better chance. That someone else could provide what she couldn't." She pulled the faded note from the suitcase again, holding it up. "Love isn't always enough, but it's always necessary. The question is whether you love someone enough to do the hard work of caring for them, or whether you love yourself more than you love them." Marcus turned back into the room, his face flushed with something between anger and pain. "That's not fair. You have no idea what Sophia and I have been going through. The phone calls from your neighbors about you wandering around confused at night. The falls. The time you left the stove on and nearly burned the house down." "You're right," Elena said quietly. "I don't know what you've been going through. Because you never told me. Just like I never told you about the train station." The admission hung between them, heavy with recognition. Sophia shifted on the couch, her gaze moving between her brother and grandmother. "Maybe we should all try telling the truth for once." Elena smiled at her younger granddaughter, and for the first time that day it reached her eyes. Truth has a way of setting things free, even when it hurts. "Let me tell you about Frank Morrison, and what real care looks like." She settled back in her chair, her eyes distant again. "Those first weeks at the station were the longest of my life. Frank could have called social services immediately. It would have been the proper thing to do. But Frank had learned something about systems and bureaucracy during his grief. When his wife died, everyone had helpful suggestions about what he should do, where he should go, how he should heal. None of them actually involved seeing him as a person with his own needs and desires." Marcus found himself drawn back into the room despite his discomfort. "So he kept you at the station? He made a choice to see me as a child who needed care, not a problem that needed processing." Elena's voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there when discussing the assisted living facility. "Every morning he'd bring me breakfast from the diner down the street. Real food, eggs and toast, sometimes pancakes on Sunday. Not because it was required, but because he noticed I was too thin." She stood and walked to a photograph on her bookshelf, this one showing the Millbrook train station in its heyday, with Frank Morrison standing proudly beside the platform sign. Frank had lost everything that mattered to him 2 years before I arrived. His wife, Margaret, and their unborn son in a car accident. He could have let that loss make him bitter, closed off. Instead, he chose to let it make him more compassionate. Sophia leaned forward. "What was he like?" "Gruff on the outside. He had this way of scowling that made travelers mind their manners. But with me, Elena's smile was genuine now, colored by memory. He was patient in ways I'd never experienced when I had nightmares, and I had them every night for months. He'd sit beside that old couch in his office and tell me stories about the trains that came through, where they were going, what kind of people rode them, what adventures they might have. She returned to her chair, but this time she seemed less fragile, as if remembering Frank's kindness had given her strength. The thing about Frank was that he never made me feel like I was broken. He never treated my fear as something to be fixed quickly so he could get back to his regular life. He understood that healing takes time, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply stay present while they figure out how to trust again. Elena pulled another item from the suitcase, a small notebook, its pages yellowed and filled with childish handwriting. Frank gave me this after my first week at the station. He said writing down my thoughts might help me make sense of what was happening. But more than that, he read what I wrote. Every day. And he responded. Elena opened the notebook to a random page and read aloud. July 22nd, 1962. I dreamed about Mama again. She was on the train, but I couldn't reach her. Frank says dreams aren't real, but they feel real. I wish I could stop feeling scared all the time. She turned the page, revealing different handwriting, masculine, careful script. Elena, fear is just your heart trying to protect you from being hurt again. It's not something to be ashamed of. Tomorrow we'll practice being brave for just 5 minutes at a time. That's all courage really is. Being brave for 5 minutes, then 5 minutes more. Sophia's breath caught. He wrote back to you? Every single day for 2 years. Even after I moved in with Catherine, he kept responding to my journal entries. He never dismissed my fears, or told me I should be grateful for what I had. He met me where I was and helped me imagine where I might go. Elena closed the notebook, holding it against her chest. Frank Morrison taught me that real care isn't about finding the most efficient solution. It's about finding the most human one. Marcus finally sat down, his corporate composure cracking. What happened when you moved in with Catherine? Frank knew he couldn't keep me at the station indefinitely, but he also knew that how he handled my transition would determine whether I ever trusted another adult again. Elena's eyes grew distant, remembering. He spent weeks talking to Catherine, preparing her, not just about my basic needs, but about my specific fears, my triggers, the things that made me feel safe. And she was willing to take all that on? Sophia asked. Catherine Morrison was 48 years old, set in her ways, with a classroom full of children who already demanded her attention. Taking in a traumatized 8-year-old wasn't convenient or easy. It was complicated, expensive, and emotionally exhausting. Elena looked directly at her grandchildren, but she chose complicated over convenient because she understood that some things are worth the extra effort. The parallel was impossible to ignore. Marcus rubbed his face with both hands, his voice muffled when he spoke. This isn't the same situation, Grandma? A knock at the front door interrupted the conversation. Through the screen, they could see a tall man in a white coat carrying a medical bag. That'll be Dr. James Morrison, Elena said, a small smile playing at her lips. Frank's nephew. I called him this morning. Dr. James Morrison stepped into the living room, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was tall like his uncle, with the same kind eyes but a more polished demeanor that spoke of education and success. Elena, he said warmly, embracing her gently, you sounded upset on the phone. James, I'd like you to meet my grandchildren, Marcus and Sophia. Elena's tone was formal. They're here to pack up my life before moving me to Sunset Manor on Friday. Dr. Morrison's expression shifted, professional concern replacing social warmth. I see. And how do you feel about this arrangement, Elena? Like an 8-year-old girl standing on a train platform, watching the people who are supposed to love her disappear into the distance. The doctor's face hardened slightly as he turned to Marcus and Sophia. I'm sorry, but I think there's been some miscommunication. I never recommended assisted living for your grandmother. Marcus stood abruptly. What? The geriatrician said, I'm Elena's primary physician. Dr. Morrison interrupted. Who exactly told you she needed to be in a facility? The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia looked at Marcus with dawning horror. Marcus, You said Dr. Peterson recommended. Dr. Peterson is a geriatrician I consulted for a second opinion, Marcus said defensively. Dr. Morrison's voice was carefully controlled. Did you bring Elena to this consultation? She was, resistant to seeing another doctor. So you discussed her medical needs with a physician who has never examined her? Dr. Morrison moved to Elena's side. Elena has some mobility issues and occasional confusion related to her medication timing, but she's mentally sharp and physically capable of independent living with minimal support. The weight of their mistakes settled over the room like a shroud. Sophia sank onto the couch, her face pale. Oh God, Grandma, we didn't. We thought we were. You thought you were doing what was necessary without doing the work to find out what was actually needed, Elena said gently. Marcus stood frozen, staring at Dr. Morrison. But the paperwork is signed. The deposit is paid. Paperwork can be unsigned, Elena said quietly. The question is whether you want to choose the complicated path of actually caring for me, or the convenient path of having someone else do it. Elena looked at her grandchildren and saw two adults struggling with the same choice Frank Morrison had faced 70 years ago. The easy path, or the meaningful one. Frank Morrison could have chosen differently, she said softly, but he chose to see me as a person worth the extra effort. Today, you have the same choice. The revelation about Dr. Peterson hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned bridges none of them could rebuild. Marcus stood frozen beside the coffee table, his face cycling through emotions, anger, shame, confusion, while Sophia pressed her hands to her cheeks as if trying to hold herself together. Dr. Morrison set his medical bag on the side table with deliberate care, his movements controlled but his eyes sharp with professional concern. Elena, may I ask how you've been managing your medications? Some days better than others, Elena admitted, her voice smaller than it had been all afternoon. I forget sometimes whether I've taken the morning pills or the evening ones. Last week, I took my blood pressure medication twice and felt dizzy for hours. That's completely manageable with proper support, Dr. Morrison said, pulling out a small notepad. A pill organizer, perhaps a visiting nurse twice weekly, and family check-ins could solve most of these issues. Marcus finally found his voice, though it sounded strained. But what about the wandering? The neighbors called 3 times last month, saying she was walking around the neighborhood at night in her nightgown. Elena's cheeks flushed pink. I was looking for Catherine's garden. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I forget she's been gone for 15 years. I think I'm still living in her house, and I want to check on her roses. The admission was so vulnerable, so human, that Sophia felt tears threatening again. Grandma, why didn't you tell us you were having trouble sleeping? When would I have told you? Marcus calls once a week to ask if I'm still alive and whether I've paid my bills. You text me on holidays and occasionally stop by to drop off groceries. Elena's tone wasn't accusatory, just tired. Neither of you has asked me how I'm doing, really doing, in years. Dr. Morrison made notes in his pad, his expression thoughtful. Elena, the confusion you're experiencing sounds like it might be related to grief as much as age. Have you been having these episodes of thinking Catherine is still alive for long? Since last spring, when I found some of her old gardening gloves in the shed. Sometimes the line between past and present gets blurry. Elena's fingers worried the edge of her sweater. Especially at night, when the house is quiet, and I can almost hear her moving around in the kitchen. Sophia moved closer to her grandmother's chair, settling on the carpet beside it like she used to do as a child during story time. Tell us about Catherine. What was it like living with her? Elena's expression softened, the vulnerability replaced by warmth. Catherine Morrison saved my life in ways that went far beyond giving me a home. Frank had given me shelter and safety, but Catherine gave me something I'd never had. The experience of being truly wanted. She reached into the suitcase and pulled out a school photograph, faded but carefully preserved. It showed a young girl with serious eyes standing beside a woman in a simple dress, both of them smiling genuinely at the camera. This was taken my first Christmas with Catherine, 1962. I'd been with her for 5 months, and I was still testing whether she would keep me. I hoarded food under my bed, had nightmares about being sent away, and refused to call her anything but Miss Morrison, because I was afraid that getting too close would make it hurt more when she left. Quote. Marcus found himself drawn back into the story despite his earlier resistance. What changed? Christmas morning. I woke up expecting nothing. We'd been too poor in Pittsburgh for Christmas gifts, and my mother had always said presents were for families that had extra money. Elena's smile was soft with memory, but there was a small wrapped package beside my bed. Inside was a little silver locket with a picture of Catherine and me together, the first photograph I'd ever owned where I looked happy. She opened the locket, which she still wore on a thin chain around her neck. The pictures were tiny but clear. Catherine's kind face beside Elena's younger one, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's view. Catherine had been taking pictures of me for months without my knowing. Pictures of me reading, helping in her garden, playing with the neighbor's cat. She said she wanted me to see myself the way she saw me, as a child worth celebrating, worth remembering, worth keeping. Dr. Morrison looked up from his notes. That's when you began to trust her? That's when I began to understand that trust isn't something you give once, and it's finished. It's something you build slowly, choice by choice, day by day. Elena closed the locket carefully. Catherine never asked me to trust her completely. She just proved, over and over, that she was worthy of whatever trust I was ready to give. Sophia wiped her eyes. How did she do that? In 100 small ways. She learned that I was afraid of raised voices because they reminded me of the fights before Papa left, so she never yelled, even when I broke her favorite teacup. She noticed that I panicked when adults whispered to each other, because in my experience that meant bad news was coming, so she always included me in conversations about my future. Elena stood and walked to a wooden cabinet, pulling out a thick photo album. But most importantly, she never treated my fears as inconveniences to be managed. She treated them as information about what I needed to feel safe. She opened the album to reveal page after page of photographs. Elena at different ages, always with Catherine or Frank, documenting years of holidays, school events, graduations, and quiet family moments. Look at this, Elena said, pointing to a photo of herself at maybe 10 years old, standing in a garden with dirt on her hands and a huge smile on her face. Catherine taught me to garden because she noticed I was still hoarding food. She said if I could grow things with my own hands, I'd never have to worry about being hungry again. Marcus studied the photograph, seeing in his grandmother's young face the same fierce independence he recognized in her now. You look happy. I was happy. For the first time in my life, I was part of something that felt permanent. Catherine made it clear that I wasn't a guest or a project or a burden. I was her daughter, chosen and loved and wanted. Dr. Morrison closed his notepad, his expression serious but hopeful. Elena, what you're describing sounds like exactly what you need now. Not institutional care, but the kind of family support that Catherine provided. Consistent, patient, and responsive to your actual needs rather than assumptions about what those needs might be. He turned to Marcus and Sophia. Your grandmother doesn't need to be managed by strangers. She needs to be supported by people who care enough to learn what she actually needs. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, his earlier certainty completely shattered. But what if we get it wrong? What if something happens and we're not prepared? Then you'll figure it out together, Elena said simply, the same way Catherine and I figured it out when I had nightmares, or when I struggled in math class, or when I got my first job and was terrified of making mistakes. She closed the photo album, but kept her hands resting on its cover. Catherine could have sent me to boarding school when I struggled academically. She could have found specialists to deal with my trauma, instead of learning how to help me herself. She could have made a dozen choices that would have been easier for her, but harder for me. Sophia reached up and took her grandmother's hand. But she didn't. She didn't. Because she understood that love isn't about finding the most convenient solution. It's about choosing to stay engaged even when engagement is difficult. Dr. Morrison stood and picked up his medical bag. I'd like to propose something. Let me come by twice a week for the next month. We'll set up a proper medication schedule, monitor Elena's sleep patterns, and work together to create a support system that keeps her independent while addressing the areas where she needs help. He looked directly at Marcus. But this only works if her family is genuinely committed to being part of the solution. If you're looking for someone else to take responsibility so you don't have to, assisted living might actually be the more honest choice. The challenge was clear, and Marcus felt it like a weight in his chest. I don't know if I know how to do what you're describing. I didn't know how to trust Catherine at first either, Elena said gently. But she was patient while I learned. She was present while I figured out how to be part of a family. She never made me feel like my learning process was a burden on her life. She stood and walked to Marcus, placing her weathered hand on his cheek the way she used to when he was small and scared. I'm not asking you to be perfect, sweetheart. I'm asking you to be present, to learn with me instead of making decisions for me. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the room filled with packed boxes and unpacked memories. 3 generations of family stood at a crossroads, each carrying their own fears about what it meant to truly care for someone else. Outside, the sound of children playing in nearby yards drifted through the windows, the sound of life continuing, of families figuring out how to love each other imperfectly but persistently. The choice remained unmade, but for the first time that day, it felt like a choice rather than a foregone conclusion. The silence stretched between them like a bridge none of them were quite ready to cross. Dr. Morrison's challenge hung in the air, and Elena could see her grandchildren wrestling with something they'd never had to face before: the difference between managing someone's decline and supporting their life. Marcus moved to the window, staring out at the street where Elena's neighbors lived their quiet lives. What if we try this and it doesn't work? What if you fall again, or get confused and wander off? Or what if Catherine had asked herself those same questions? Elena interrupted gently. What if she decided the risk of loving me wasn't worth taking? She walked back to the photo album, flipping to a section near the middle. The photographs here showed Elena as a teenager, confident, smiling, surrounded by other young people at what looked like graduation ceremonies and award presentations. Let me tell you about the moment I discovered my calling, Elena said, settling back into her chair. I was 16, working part-time at the county social services office to earn money for college. Catherine had arranged the job through a friend, thinking it would be good experience for someone interested in nursing. Sophia moved closer, drawn by the change in her grandmother's voice. It had taken on the cadence of someone sharing something sacred. A social worker named Mrs. Henderson brought in a boy about 7 years old. His name was Michael, and his father had dropped him off at a fire station 3 days earlier with a note saying he couldn't handle being a single parent anymore. Elena's fingers traced the edge of a photograph showing her teenage self kneeling beside a small, dark-haired boy. Michael hadn't spoken a word since his father left. Marcus turned from the window, despite himself drawn back into the story. What did you do? At first, nothing. I was just a file clerk, organizing paperwork and answering phones. But during my lunch break, I found Michael sitting alone in the children's waiting area, staring at a picture book but not really seeing it. Elena's voice softened. He had the same look I remembered seeing in my own reflection during those first weeks at the train station. The expression of a child who's trying to understand how the most important person in their world could just disappear. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing the boy with a tentative smile, his hand in Elena's as they stood beside a playground. I sat down next to him and started talking, not asking questions or trying to get him to respond, just talking. I told him about trains, about the different kinds of cars they pulled and where they might be going. The same kinds of stories Frank used to tell me. Dr. Morrison had taken a seat on the couch, his earlier urgency replaced by something that looked like recognition. You connected with him. After about 20 minutes, he looked up at me and whispered, "Do you think the trains ever come back?" It was the first thing he'd said since his father left. Elena's eyes grew bright with the memory. I told him that some trains make round trips, but the important thing wasn't whether they came back. It was finding people at the new station who would be happy to see you arrive. Sophia felt tears threatening again. What happened to him? Michael was placed with a foster family within the week, but Mrs. Henderson asked me to visit him during the transition, to help him adjust. She said she'd never seen a child respond to someone the way he'd responded to me. Elena turned to a section of the album filled with letters and drawings. He wrote to me for years. Graduated high school, went to college, became a teacher himself. He said he wanted to help other kids find their way to new stations. She closed the album and looked directly at her grandchildren. That's when I understood that my abandonment at the train station wasn't just something that happened to me. It was preparation for something I was meant to do. Marcus found his voice, though it sounded uncertain. You decided to become a social worker because of one child? I decided to become a social worker because I realized I had something other people couldn't give to abandoned children, the absolute certainty that survival was possible. That being unwanted by one person, or even several people, didn't mean you were unworthy of love. Elena stood and walked to a display case Marcus and Sophia had barely noticed earlier. Inside were awards, certificates, and photographs spanning decades of professional achievement. I worked with over 300 children during my career. Some were abandoned like Michael and me. Others were abused, neglected, caught in custody battles, or aging out of foster care with nowhere to go. She touched the glass covering a particularly worn certificate. Every single one of them taught me something about resilience, about the capacity human beings have to heal from the deepest wounds. Sophia joined her grandmother at the display case, reading the inscriptions on various awards. Distinguished Service Award, Pennsylvania Department of Children and Families. Outstanding Achievement in Foster Care Reform. Community Hero Recognition. She looked up at Elena with something approaching awe. Grandma, why didn't we know about any of this? Elena's smile was sad but not bitter. When did you ever ask about my work? When did either of you show interest in what I did with my life beyond raising you? The question hit its mark. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized the truth. He'd never once asked his grandmother about her career, her achievements, her passions. He'd seen her as simply Grandma, the woman who made sure he had clean clothes and helped with homework, not as Elena Rossi, the professional who had dedicated her life to helping society's most vulnerable children. Dr. Morrison stood and approached the display case. Elena never told you that she helped establish the county's first specialized program for children who'd experienced abandonment trauma? What? Sophia's voice was barely a whisper. Or that she was consulted by 3 other states when they were developing their own programs? Dr. Morrison continued. Elena's work became a model for trauma-informed care that's still being used today. Elena waved her hand dismissively. James, that's not. It absolutely is relevant, he interrupted gently. Your grandchildren are making decisions about your future based on the assumption that you're a frail elderly woman who's become a burden. They have no idea they're talking about institutionalizing someone who spent 50 years proving that the right kind of care can transform lives. Marcus felt as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted fundamentally. Grandma, we had no idea. How could you? You never asked. Elena's voice wasn't accusatory, just tired. For years you've seen me as your grandmother, who raised you after your parents divorced. You've never seen me as Elena, the woman who chose to turn her childhood trauma into a mission to help other children heal. She returned to her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 78 years. Do you know what the hardest part of my job was? It wasn't the heartbreaking cases or the bureaucratic frustrations. It was the families who gave up too easily. The parents who decided that loving their children through difficulties was too complicated, too expensive, too inconvenient. The parallel she was drawing was unmistakable, and Marcus felt it like a physical blow. That's not what we're doing, isn't it? Elena's eyes met his directly. You've decided that my needs are too complicated for you to handle. You found a solution that puts trained professionals in charge of my care so you don't have to figure out how to provide it yourselves. Sophia sank onto the couch, her face pale. But we thought we were helping. We thought we were making sure you'd be safe. I'm sure that's what you told yourselves. Just like the parents who brought their children to me told themselves they were doing what was best. Elena leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. But safety without love isn't actually safety. It's just survival. and I've survived enough for one lifetime. Dr. Morrison picked up his medical bag, his expression serious. I'm going to leave you all to think about this. Elena, I'll be back tomorrow morning with some medication organizers and information about visiting nurse services. But I want to be clear. None of this works unless your family is genuinely committed to being part of your support system. He paused at the door, looking back at Marcus and Sophia. Your grandmother spent her career proving that with the right support, people can heal from the deepest wounds and go on to live meaningful, independent lives. It would be ironic if her own family decided she wasn't worth that same kind of commitment. After he left, the house felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of Elena's revelations had compressed the space around them. The packed boxes that had seemed so necessary that morning now looked like evidence of their own emotional distance. Grandma, Marcus said finally, his voice hoarse, I don't know how to undo what we've set in motion. You start by asking different questions, Elena replied. Instead of asking how to manage my decline, ask how to support my life. Instead of asking what's most convenient for you, ask what I actually need. She stood and walked to the old suitcase, running her fingers along its worn edges. Frank Morrison could have taken the easy path. Catherine could have chosen convenience over commitment. Instead, they chose to see potential rather than problems. They chose to invest in relationship rather than just finding a solution. Elena looked at her grandchildren, really looked at them, and saw two adults struggling with the same choice that had defined her entire professional life. The question isn't whether you're capable of caring for me. The question is whether you want to choose the kind of love that transforms rather than the kind that simply manages. The room fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to press against their skin. Elena's words about transformational love versus management hung between them like a judgment none of them were prepared to face. Marcus stood frozen by the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass, while Sophia remained on the couch, her hands twisted in her lap. I need to tell you something, Elena said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. Something I've never told either of you about why I took you in after your parents' divorce. Marcus turned from the window, wariness creeping into his expression. Grandma, we know you took us in because Mom couldn't handle. No, Elena interrupted firmly. You know the story you've told yourselves. You don't know the truth. She walked to a different section of her bookshelf and pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents and photographs. Her movements were deliberate, as if she'd been preparing for this moment for years. Your mother didn't call me because she couldn't handle raising you alone. She called me because she was afraid she was going to repeat the cycle that nearly destroyed me. Elena opened the folder, revealing child welfare documents, court papers, and handwritten notes. She was having what we'd now call a mental health crisis. She was talking about leaving you both at school one day and never coming back. Sophia's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. What? Your father had moved across the country for his new job. Your mother was working 60 hours a week trying to make ends meet, and she felt like she was drowning. Elena's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she handled the papers. She called me at 2 a.m, crying so hard I could barely understand her. She said she finally understood why her own grandmother had abandoned my mother. She said she was starting to think you'd both be better off without her. Marcus moved away from the window, his face pale. She wanted to abandon us? She wanted to not feel like she was failing you every single day. There's a difference, but when you're drowning, it's hard to see it. Elena pulled out a photograph of Marcus and Sophia as children, maybe 8 and 6 years old, standing in her front yard with uncertain smiles. I drove to Chicago that night and brought you both home with me. She set the photograph on the coffee table between them, next to the old suitcase that had started this entire conversation. I made a choice that night. I chose to break the cycle of abandonment that had been passed down through our family like a curse. Sophia leaned forward, studying the photograph. How long were we supposed to stay? 2 weeks. Just until your mother could get some help and figure out a sustainable plan. Elena's smile was bitter. But 2 weeks became 2 months. Then 6 months. Then 2 years. By the time your mother was stable enough to take you back, you'd both made it clear you wanted to stay with me. Marcus felt something cold settling in his chest. We chose to stay with you instead of going back to Mom? You were children who'd found stability after chaos. Of course you wanted to stay where you felt safe. Elena's voice carried the weight of someone who'd made difficult decisions for decades. But your mother never forgave herself for not being able to provide what I could provide. And she never forgave me for succeeding where she felt she'd failed. The implications of this revelation rippled through the room like shockwaves. Sophia pressed her hands to her face. Is that why Mom always seemed distant? Why she never really seemed comfortable around us? Your mother loved you desperately, but every time she looked at you, she saw evidence of her own failure. She saw the children she couldn't keep, thriving with the grandmother who could. Elena gathered the papers back into the folder with careful precision. I tried to encourage your relationship with her, but she pulled away. She said it was easier to love you from a distance than to be constantly reminded of her inadequacy. Marcus sank into a chair, his usual composure completely shattered. So we lost our mother because you were better at taking care of us than she was? You lost your mother because abandonment had already broken her before she ever became a parent. Because no one ever taught her that asking for help isn't the same as admitting failure. Because she'd rather disappear than be seen as inadequate. Elena's voice grew stronger, more certain. I refuse to let that cycle continue with you. She stood and began pacing, her movements sharp with emotion. Do you know what I sacrificed to raise you? I turned down a promotion that would have required travel because Marcus had nightmares when I was away overnight. I dated exactly 2 men in 15 years, because Sophia had abandonment anxiety that flared up whenever I showed attention to anyone else. Sophia looked up, tears streaming down her face. Grandma, we never knew. Of course you didn't. That was the point. I was determined that you would never feel unwanted, never question whether you were worth the effort it took to love you. Elena stopped pacing and faced them both directly. I worked 60-hour weeks helping other people's children while making sure you never felt like my career was more important than you were. Marcus found his voice, though it sounded hollow. But we did feel that way sometimes. When you'd get calls in the middle of dinner about emergency cases. When you'd have to leave our school events to handle crisis situations. And how did I respond to those feelings? Elena's question was sharp, challenging. Marcus thought back, remembering. You'd always make time later. You'd ask us about what happened at school, or help with homework, or... His voice trailed off as understanding dawned. I'd make sure you knew that even when other children needed my professional help, you were my priority. That my love for you wasn't diminished by my responsibility to others. Elena's voice softened slightly. It wasn't perfect. I made mistakes. But I never, ever made you feel like you were burdens I needed to manage, rather than children I'd chosen to love. The parallel she was drawing became impossible to ignore. Sophia wiped her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. We're doing to you what Mom almost did to us. Yes, you're deciding that caring for me is too complicated, too demanding, too disruptive to your lives. You're choosing the path that feels easier for you, rather than asking what would actually be best for me. Elena walked to the packed boxes, her movements deliberate. She opened one and pulled out a framed photograph. Marcus at his college graduation, Sophia at her wedding, both of them beaming beside their grandmother, who had sacrificed so much to help them reach those moments. I made a promise to myself when I took you in. I promised that the cycle of abandonment would end with my generation. That you would grow up knowing what unconditional love felt like, what it meant to be chosen and wanted and fought for. She held up the photograph, her voice breaking slightly. I thought I'd succeeded. I thought I'd raised 2 adults who understood that family means choosing to stay when staying is hard. That love isn't about convenience. It's about commitment. Marcus stood abruptly, his face flushed with shame and anger, though Elena couldn't tell if the anger was directed at her or at himself. That's not fair. We're not abandoning you. We're trying to make sure you get proper care. From strangers. In a place designed for efficiency rather than relationship. Where the staff will monitor my vital signs but won't know that I still have nightmares about train stations, or that I need to feel useful to feel human. Elena set the photograph on the mantel, next to the clock that would soon be donated along with everything else that had meaning in her life. Tell me, Marcus, when you signed those papers for Sunset Manor, did you think about what I might want? Or did you decide, like your mother almost did, That you knew what was best for me? The question hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be answered without admitting guilt. Marcus felt the walls he'd built around his emotions beginning to crack under the weight of recognition. I thought, he began, then stopped. I thought we were being responsible. Responsible to whom? To me, or to your own need to not be inconvenienced by my aging? The words hit like physical blows. Sophia was crying openly now, her carefully constructed rationalization of their decision crumbling under her grandmother's relentless logic. Grandma, please, Sophia said through her tears. We don't want to abandon you. We just don't know how to take care of you the way you need. Quote, Elena's expressions softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Then learn, the same way I learned to take care of traumatized children, the same way Catherine learned to love someone else's daughter, the same way I learned to raise two scared, confused children whose world had fallen apart. She moved to stand directly in front of them, her small frame somehow commanding the entire room. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to choose complicated over convenient. I'm asking you to break the cycle that's been poisoning our family for generations. The afternoon light was fading, and the house felt suspended in time, caught between the past Elena had survived and the future her grandchildren were still choosing. 3 generations of family stood at the same crossroads that had defined Elena's entire life. The choice between abandonment and commitment, between managing problems and nurturing relationships. You have until Friday to decide, Elena said quietly. You can continue with your plan and know that you've chosen the same path your mother almost chose with you. Or you can choose to be the family I believed I was raising you to become. The silence that followed Elena's ultimatum was broken only by the sound of Sophia's quiet sobbing and the distant hum of traffic outside. Marcus stood motionless, staring at the photograph on the mantel, himself and Sophia with their grandmother on graduation day, all 3 of them radiating joy and pride. The image felt like evidence from a crime scene now, proof of love that had somehow curdled into abandonment. I can't do this, Marcus said suddenly, his voice tight with something between panic and rage. I can't sit here and be accused of abandoning you when all we've tried to do is help. He moved toward the door with jerky, agitated steps, but Elena's voice stopped him before he could reach it. Running away won't change what you've heard today, Marcus. I'm not running away. I'm removing myself from a conversation that's become manipulative and unfair. He turned back to face her, his face flushed with defensive anger. You're using emotional blackmail to make us feel guilty for trying to ensure your safety. Elena studied her grandson with the clinical assessment she'd once used to evaluate families in crisis. Is that what you think I'm doing? I think you're a master manipulator who spent 70 years learning how to make people feel guilty for not giving you what you want. The words came out harsher than Marcus had intended, but once spoken, he couldn't take them back. Sophia looked up at her brother in shock. Marcus! No, it's fine, Elena said calmly, settling back into her chair with the resigned grace of someone who'd been expecting this moment. Let him say what he really thinks. Truth has a way of clearing the air, even when it hurts. Marcus felt something unleash inside him, years of suppressed resentment and guilt that he'd never allowed himself to examine. You want truth? Here's truth. You made us feel guilty our entire childhood for needing anything you couldn't provide. Every time Mom tried to reconnect with us, you'd find subtle ways to remind us how much you'd sacrificed. Every time we wanted to spend time with friends or pursue our own interests, you'd get that look, that martyred expression that said we were being ungrateful. Elena listened without interrupting, her face carefully neutral. Sophia stared at her brother as if seeing him for the first time. And now, Marcus continued, his voice growing louder, now you're doing it again. Using your tragic childhood to make us feel like monsters for not wanting to become your full-time caregivers. Well, I'm sorry you were abandoned, Grandma. I'm sorry your mother couldn't take care of you, and I'm sorry your life was hard. But that doesn't give you the right to hold us hostage with guilt. The room fell silent except for the sound of Marcus's heavy breathing. Elena sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Are you finished? She asked quietly. I don't know. Maybe. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, suddenly looking exhausted. I need you to understand that we're not the villains in this story. We're trying to do the right thing. Elena nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. You're absolutely right about some things, Marcus. I did make you feel guilty sometimes when you were children. I did use my sacrifices as a way to ensure your loyalty. And I am using my story to try to influence your decision now. The admission surprised him. He'd expected denial, argument, more emotional manipulation. But, Elena continued, her voice gaining strength, I want to tell you why. I want to tell you about the phone call that changed everything for me. She stood and walked to a small desk in the corner of the room, pulling out a letter that had been carefully preserved in a clear plastic sleeve. This arrived 3 weeks after your mother's funeral, Marcus. You were both so busy with arrangements and settling her estate that I never found the right time to share it with you. She handed him the letter, and he could see immediately that it was written in his mother's handwriting, shaky, as if she'd been ill when she wrote it. Read it, Elena said simply. Marcus unfolded the letter with trembling hands, and Sophia moved to read over his shoulder. Their mother's familiar script filled the page. Mom, I know I don't have much time left, and there are things I need to say while I still can. I've spent 30 years being angry at you for succeeding where I failed, for giving Marcus and Sophia what I couldn't give them. I convinced myself that you stole my children from me, that you manipulated them into loving you more than they loved me. But lying here in this hospital bed, I finally understand what really happened. You didn't steal my children, you saved them. You gave them the stability and unconditional love that I was too broken to provide. You broke the cycle of abandonment that had been destroying our family for generations. I need you to know that I don't blame you anymore. I blame myself for being too proud to accept help, too damaged to heal, too afraid to fight for my children when fighting felt too hard. You did what I couldn't do, and I will be grateful for that until the day I die. But Mom, I'm scared about what happens when you're gone. Marcus has built walls around his heart that I recognize, because I built the same ones. Sophia gives so much of herself to others that she forgets to ask for what she needs. They learned how to love by watching you, but they also learned how to carry guilt and sacrifice themselves for others. Please don't let them take care of you the way you took care of everyone else, by giving up their own lives and happiness. You've already broken one cycle. Don't let them start another one. All my love and all my regret. Sarah Marcus's hands were shaking by the time he finished reading. Sophia was crying again, but quietly now, her tears falling onto the letter. She wrote this 2 weeks before she died, Elena said softly, and every word of it is true. I did steal you from her, in a way. Not intentionally, but the result was the same. I was so determined to give you what I'd never had that I didn't stop to consider what it might cost your relationship with your mother. She took the letter back from Marcus's nerveless fingers, handling it with the reverence reserved for sacred texts. And she was right about something else, too. I did teach you to sacrifice yourselves for others. I taught you to carry guilt and responsibility that wasn't yours to carry. Marcus sank into a chair, his earlier anger replaced by something that felt like grief. Why are you showing us this now? Because your mother was also right about the walls you've built around your heart, Marcus. And she was right about Sophia giving so much to others that she forgets to ask for what she needs. Elena sat back down, suddenly looking every one of her 78 years. You're both trying to take care of me the way I taught you to take care of others, by sacrificing your own comfort and happiness for what you think is my greater good. Sophia wiped her eyes, her voice hoarse. But isn't that what love is supposed to be? Putting other people's needs first? That's what I thought for most of my life. It's what I learned from Catherine, who gave up any chance of her own family to raise me. It's what I practiced in my career, putting my clients' needs above everything else. And it's what I taught you. Elena's voice was heavy with recognition, but your mother understood something at the end that it's taken me until now to see. Love that requires constant sacrifice isn't sustainable. It creates resentment, guilt, and ultimately the very abandonment we're trying to prevent. She pulled the wooden train from the suitcase, turning it over in her weathered hands. Frank Morrison taught me that real love means choosing to stay when staying is hard. But he never meant that love should be martyrdom. He meant that love requires commitment, presence, and the willingness to work through difficulties together. Marcus looked up at his grandmother, his defenses finally cracking. I don't know how to love people without feeling guilty about my own needs. I know, because I taught you that. I modeled sacrifice instead of balance, guilt instead of healthy boundaries. Elena's voice was gentle but certain, and now I'm asking you to break another cycle. Not the cycle of abandonment this time, but the cycle of love as self-destruction. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where her neighbors lived their complicated, imperfect lives. I don't want you to sacrifice your happiness to take care of me. I want you to find a way to support my independence while maintaining your own lives. I want you to choose love that enhances rather than diminishes all of us. Sophia joined her at the window. How do we do that? We start by having honest conversations about what we all actually need, instead of making assumptions about what's best for each other. Elena turned to face both of her grandchildren. We figure out how to care for each other without losing ourselves in the process. Marcus stood slowly, his expression thoughtful. The assisted living decision, we never asked you what you wanted. You decided what felt safest and most manageable for you, then convinced yourselves it was what I needed. Elena's voice held no accusation now, just tired recognition. Just like I used to make decisions about your childhood based on what felt safest for me, then convinced myself it was what you needed. The afternoon had faded into early evening, and the house felt different somehow, less like a museum of Elena's life, and more like a space where three people were finally learning to see each other clearly. I'm scared, Sophia admitted quietly. I'm scared we'll mess this up. I'm scared something will happen to you and it will be our fault. I'm scared too, Elena replied. I'm scared of being a burden. I'm scared of losing my independence. I'm scared of dying alone in a place where no one knows my story. Marcus moved closer to both women, his usual emotional distance replaced by something raw and uncertain. Maybe we're all scared of the wrong things. Elena looked at her grandson with surprise. What do you mean? Maybe the question isn't how to avoid making mistakes. Maybe it's how to make mistakes together, as a family, instead of avoiding each other to prevent the possibility of failure. The observation hung in the air between them, simple but profound. Outside, the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, and the sound of families calling children in for dinner drifted through the windows. Your mother's letter had a postscript, Elena said suddenly, pulling the letter out again. I didn't read it before because it felt too personal. But maybe you should hear it now. She unfolded the paper and read the final lines in her daughter's shaky handwriting. Tell them that love isn't about never making mistakes. It's about making mistakes together. And choosing to forgive each other. Tell them that family isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, even when showing up is messy and complicated and hard. The evening light had completely faded by the time Dr. Morrison returned, as promised, carrying a small bag of medical supplies and wearing the expression of someone who had spent the day thinking deeply about the conversation he'd witnessed. He found the three of them still in the living room, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The packed boxes remained, but they seemed less final now, more like possibilities than foregone conclusions. How are we doing? He asked, setting his bag down and taking in their tear-streaked faces, and Elena's obvious exhaustion. We're having the conversation we should have had months ago, Sophia said, her voice hoarse but steady. Maybe years ago. Dr. Morrison nodded, pulling out a chair and settling into it with the easy familiarity of someone who had been part of Elena's extended family for decades. Elena, you look tired. Have you been taking care of yourself today? Quote, I've been taking care of some long overdue truth-telling, Elena replied, managing a small smile. It's more exhausting than I expected. Marcus, who had been standing by the window for the past hour, turned to face the doctor. "Dr. Morrison, I need to ask you something directly. Are we making a mistake about the assisted living?" "That depends on what you're trying to achieve," Dr. Morrison replied carefully. "If you're trying to ensure that Elena receives adequate medical monitoring and assistance with daily tasks, Sunset Manor could accomplish that. If you're trying to support her independence while maintaining your family relationships, then yes, you're making a significant mistake." He pulled out the pill organizers he'd promised, setting them on the coffee table next to Elena's old suitcase. "These are weekly organizers with alarm settings. A visiting nurse can fill them twice a week and monitor Elena's medication compliance. Total cost, about what you'd pay for 3 days at Sunset Manor." Sophia moved closer to examine the organizers. "It's really that simple?" "The medication management is that simple. The family dynamics are considerably more complex." Dr. Morrison's tone was gentle but direct. "Elena doesn't need institutional care. She needs a support system that allows her to age in place while staying connected to the people who matter to her." Elena watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone whose future was being decided by others, but for the first time all day, she didn't feel like a passive participant in her own life. "What would that actually look like?" Marcus asked, his corporate mind seeking practical details. "Day to day, I mean." Dr. Morrison pulled out a folder of information he'd clearly prepared in advance. Home health aide for 3 hours twice a week to help with cleaning and meal preparation. Visiting nurse twice weekly for medication management and basic health monitoring. Physical therapy once a week to maintain mobility and prevent falls. Emergency alert system for peace of mind. He spread the papers on the coffee table. Total monthly cost, roughly 60% of what you'd pay for assisted living. Elena maintains her independence, stays in her own home, keeps her social connections in the neighborhood. Marcus studied the numbers, his expression thoughtful. "And our role in all this?" "That's up to you," Elena said before Dr. Morrison could respond. "But I'd like to suggest something different from what I did when I raised you." She stood and walked to the kitchen, returning with a pot of coffee and 3 cups. The simple domestic gesture somehow shifted the entire tone of the conversation, from crisis management to family planning. "When you were children, I made most of the decisions about your lives and then informed you of them. I thought I was protecting you from adult worries, but I was also teaching you that love means taking responsibility for other people's choices." Elena poured coffee with steady hands, her movements deliberate and careful. "I'd like us to make decisions together this time." Sophia accepted a cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. "What kinds of decisions?" "Everything. Which days the aid comes. What kind of help I actually need versus what you think I need. How often you visit, call, or check in. What happens if my condition changes?" Elena settled back into her chair, looking more energetic than she had all day. "I want to be a participant in my own care plan, not a problem to be solved." Dr. Morrison smiled approvingly. "That's exactly the approach that leads to successful aging in place. Family involvement without family burnout. Support without dependence." Marcus remained standing, but his posture had relaxed slightly. "What about the things we were worried about? The confusion, the wandering, the safety issues?" "All manageable with the right interventions," Dr. Morrison replied. Elena's confusion episodes seemed to be triggered by grief and isolation, not dementia. The wandering happens when she can't sleep, which we can address with better sleep hygiene and possibly medication adjustment. The safety issues are mostly about fall prevention, which physical therapy and some minor home modifications can address. Elena set down her coffee cup, her expression serious. "But I need you both to understand something. Even with all the right support in place, there will still be risks. I might fall again, I might have more episodes of confusion, I might need increasing levels of care as I age." She looked directly at Marcus. "If you choose to support my independence, you're choosing to worry about me sometimes. You're choosing to be inconvenienced occasionally. You're choosing the messy, complicated path of staying involved in my life." Marcus finally sat down, accepting the coffee Elena offered him. "And if we choose the assisted living route?" then you're choosing the illusion of safety and the reality of detachment. You'll worry less about my day-to-day welfare, but you'll lose the opportunity to be part of my remaining years in any meaningful way. Elena's voice was matter-of-fact, not accusatory. Both choices have consequences. The question is which consequences you can live with. Sophia had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. Grandma, what do you want? Not what you think we can handle, or what would be easiest for us, but what would make you happiest. Elena smiled at her younger granddaughter, the first genuinely warm expression she'd worn all day. I want to wake up in my own bed, in the house where I've lived for 40 years. I want to tend Catherine's garden and watch the children in the neighborhood grow up. I want to have dinner with you sometimes, and I want you to call me when you have problems you need to talk through. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. I want to feel useful. I want to mentor young social workers, maybe volunteer with children who've experienced trauma. I want to write down my stories so they don't die with me. I want to live, not just survive. She paused, looking at both of her grandchildren. But most of all, I want to spend whatever time I have left rebuilding the relationship we've lost over the years. I want to be your grandmother again, not your burden. The silence that followed was different from the tense quiet that had characterized the earlier part of the day. This felt like possibility, like the space between a question and its answer. Dr. Morrison began packing up his materials. I'm going to leave these medication organizers and my care plan recommendations. Take the night to think about it. Talk to each other. Remember that you can always modify the plan as circumstances change. He stood and embraced Elena gently. Whatever you decide, I'm proud of you for having this conversation. It takes courage to ask for what you need instead of accepting what others think you should want. After he left, the three of them sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. The packed boxes loomed around them, but they no longer felt like monuments to ending. They felt like choices that could still be unmade. I keep thinking about something Mom wrote in that letter, Sophia said finally. About not letting us start another cycle of sacrificing ourselves for others. Elena nodded. Your mother understood something important. That love isn't supposed to destroy the people who practice it. That caring for others should enhance our lives, not replace them. Marcus set down his coffee cup, his expression thoughtful. What would that look like, practically? How do we support you without becoming your full-time caregivers? We start by having honest conversations about what we all need, Elena replied. I need to feel safe and independent. You need to feel like you're fulfilling your responsibilities without sacrificing your own lives. Sophia needs to not carry the entire emotional burden of family relationships. She stood and began walking around the room, touching various objects that had been marked for donation. We figure out how to share responsibility, how to set boundaries that protect everyone, how to love each other without guilt or resentment. Sophia joined her grandmother, picking up a framed photo of the three of them from several Christmases ago. I want to try, Grandma. I want to figure out how to do this right. Marcus remained seated, but his expression had softened. I'm scared I don't know how to be the kind of person who makes the complicated choice. Elena walked over to her grandson, placing her hand on his shoulder. Then you'll learn. The same way I learned to trust Catherine after being abandoned. The same way I learned to help traumatized children heal. The same way we all learn to do difficult things, one day at a time, with patience and forgiveness for our mistakes. She squeezed his shoulder gently. But Marcus, you have to want to learn. You have to choose to be uncomfortable sometimes, to be inconvenienced occasionally, to worry about someone other than yourself on a regular basis. Marcus looked up at his grandmother and, for a moment, Sophia saw him as the 8-year-old boy he'd been when Elena first took them in. Scared, uncertain, but willing to trust. What if I mess it up? He asked quietly. Then we'll figure it out together, Elena said simply. That's what families do. They mess up, they forgive each other, and they try again. Outside, the neighborhood had settled into its evening rhythm. Porch lights glowed warmly, and the sound of families sharing dinner and homework, and the ordinary intimacies of daily life drifted through the windows. 3 generations of family sat together in the gathering darkness, finally ready to choose the messy, complicated, transformative work of loving each other without losing themselves in the process. The choice was still unmade, but for the first time all day, it felt like a choice rather than a defeat. Marcus left Elena's house that evening without saying goodbye, his departure marked only by the sound of his car engine starting in the driveway and the headlights sweeping across the living room windows. Elena and Sophia watched him go, neither of them surprised by his retreat, but both understanding that his silence meant he was processing something too large for immediate response. "He'll be back," Elena said quietly, settling into her chair with the confidence of someone who had spent decades reading people in crisis. "How can you be sure?" Sophia asked, still standing by the window where she could see his taillights disappearing down the street. "Because he's never been able to leave a problem unsolved, even when solving it requires him to change everything he thought he knew about himself." The house felt different with just the two of them, smaller but somehow more intimate. Sophia helped Elena unpack some of the kitchen items they'd boxed earlier, a silent acknowledgement that Friday's move was no longer inevitable. "Grandma," Sophia said as she unwrapped Elena's grandmother's china, "why didn't you ever tell us about your childhood before today?" Elena considered the question while running her fingers over a delicate teacup painted with tiny roses. "For the same reason you've never told me about the panic attacks you've been having since your divorce, or the financial problems that keep you awake at night." Sophia froze, a plate halfway to the cabinet. "How did you? I raised you, sweetheart. I know when you're struggling, even when you think you're hiding it perfectly." Elena's voice was gentle but direct. "We've all been protecting each other from our vulnerabilities instead of sharing them. It's not a sustainable way to love someone." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, returning Elena's life to its proper places. As they did, Sophia found herself seeing her grandmother's possessions differently. Not as clutter to be managed, but as evidence of a rich, complex life lived in service to others. "The panic attacks started after Mom died," Sophia admitted suddenly. "Every time I think about losing someone else, I can't breathe. That's part of why the assisted living felt safer. If something happened to you at home, you'd blame yourself," Elena finished. "Just like I blamed myself every time a child in my care was hurt, even when I'd done everything right." Elena set down the teacup and turned to face her granddaughter fully. "Sophia, love always involves risk. The risk that the people we care about will suffer, will make poor choices, will need more than we can give. But eliminating risk isn't the same as providing love." 3 days passed with no word from Marcus. Elena continued her normal routines, tending her garden, reading, responding to letters from former clients who had become lifelong friends. Sophia called every evening and visited twice, bringing her teenage daughter Maya along on the second visit. Maya had always been close to her great-grandmother, drawn by Elena's stories and her complete absence of condescension when talking to young people. As they sat in the garden Thursday evening, Maya asked the question that had been troubling her since learning about the assisted living plan. "Great-grandma, are you really okay living alone? Mom's been worried sick about you." Elena smiled at her great-granddaughter's directness. "I'm okay with the risks of living alone, Maya. What I'm not okay with is the certainty of living without purpose or independence. But what if you fall again? What if something really bad happens? Then it happens. Death isn't the worst thing that can happen to someone my age, sweetheart. The worst thing is spending your remaining years existing without really living." Maya considered this with the seriousness of someone just beginning to understand that life involves trade-offs. "Is that what would happen at the nursing home?" "Not necessarily. Some people thrive in community settings. But for me, yes. I would be safe and well-fed and utterly miserable." That evening, after Sophia and Maya had gone home, Elena called Dr. Morrison to discuss the visiting nurse arrangements. They were deep in conversation about medication schedules when her doorbell rang. Marcus stood on her front porch holding a bag of takeout from her favorite Italian restaurant and wearing the expression of someone who had spent 3 days wrestling with demons and wasn't sure who had won. "I brought dinner," he said simply. "If you're willing to eat with someone who's been an ass." Elena stepped aside to let him in, noting the shadows under his eyes and the careful way he moved, as if he were still recovering from a physical blow. "Dr. Morrison, I'll call you back," she said into the phone. "My grandson has apparently decided to rejoin the conversation." They ate in relative silence, The takeout containers spread across Elena's kitchen table, alongside the pill organizers Dr. Morrison had left. Marcus picked at his food, clearly struggling with how to begin. "I went to see Dr. Morrison yesterday," he said finally. "I asked him to walk me through exactly what your care plan would look like." Elena waited, sensing there was more. "Then I went to Sunset Manor and asked for a tour." Marcus set down his fork, his expression grim. "You were right. It's clean and safe and utterly soulless. The residents I saw looked like they were waiting to die." "And how did that make you feel?" "Terrified that I almost did that to you. Ashamed that I convinced myself it was for your own good." Marcus looked directly at his grandmother for the first time since arriving. "And angry that you've spent your whole life teaching other people how to love their families while I never learned how to love mine." Elena reached across the table and took his hand. "Marcus, I never taught you how to love without guilt or fear because I didn't know how myself. We're both learning." "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. "I don't know if I can be the kind of person who chooses complicated over convenient." "Then start small. Choose one complicated thing this week. Then another next week. Love isn't a talent you're born with. It's a skill you develop through practice." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at their joined hands. "I called the assisted living facility this morning and canceled the contract." Elena felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you. I also called my office and arranged to work from home 2 days a week so I can be more available." He looked up at her, uncertainty still evident in his expression. "I don't know what that looks like yet, but I want to figure it out." "It looks like showing up," Elena said simply. "Not perfectly, not with all the answers, but consistently and with genuine care." Quote, Marcus stood and began clearing the takeout containers, a small domestic gesture that somehow felt monumental. "Sophia said you've been having trouble sleeping. Something about missing Catherine?" Elena was surprised by his attention to this detail. "Sometimes the line between past and present gets blurry at night. I find myself expecting to hear her in the kitchen, or I worry about her roses needing water." "What helps?" "Talking to someone. Having another person's voice to anchor me in the present." Elena watched her grandson's face carefully. "It doesn't have to be dramatic intervention, Marcus. Sometimes it's just a phone call before bed." Marcus nodded, processing this information with the systematic approach he brought to all problems. What else? What other small things could make a difference? They spent the next hour going through Dr. Morrison's care recommendations together, Marcus asking detailed questions about timing, costs, and logistics. Elena found herself impressed by his thoroughness, once it was directed toward actually helping rather than managing her away. "There's something else," Marcus said as they finished reviewing the paperwork. "I want to understand what you went through as a child. Not just the facts, but what it felt like. How you survived it." Elena studied her grandson's face, seeing genuine curiosity where there had been defensive anger 3 days ago. "Why now?" "Because I realized I've spent my whole adult life running from emotional vulnerability, building walls to protect myself from feeling what you must have felt when you were abandoned." Marcus's voice was quiet but steady. "I can't take care of you properly if I'm too afraid of my own feelings to understand yours." Elena felt tears prick her eyes, not the bitter tears she'd shed earlier in the week, but tears of recognition and hope. It felt like disappearing, like being erased from the world by the person who was supposed to love you most. And Frank and Catherine? They proved that love could exist without the constant fear of loss. That being vulnerable with someone didn't guarantee they would leave. Elena smiled through her tears. "They taught me that healing is possible, even from the deepest wounds." Marcus reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I want to learn that too." Outside, the neighborhood had settled into its evening quiet. 3 generations of family were finally learning to see each other clearly, to choose connection over protection, to love without the devastating burden of perfection. It wasn't a complete transformation. There would be mistakes, misunderstandings, moments when old patterns reasserted themselves. But it was a beginning, And sometimes a beginning is all the hope you need. 6 months later, Elena's living room hosted an unusual gathering. Young social workers from the county office sat cross-legged on the floor, while Elena, settled in her favorite armchair, shared the story that had defined her life's work. The old suitcase sat open on the coffee table, its contents no longer painful relics but teaching tools. "The most important thing I learned," Elena said, holding up the wooden train Frank had carved for her, "is that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to stay when staying is hard." Marcus entered quietly from the kitchen, carrying a tray of coffee for the visitors. He'd kept his promise about working from home twice a week, and Elena had grown accustomed to his presence, not hovering, but available. The visiting nurse had pronounced Elena's medication compliance perfect, and her episodes of nighttime confusion had virtually disappeared once she'd started sleeping better. Sophia arrived as the session was ending, Maya in tow. 3 generations of women embraced in Elena's hallway, a picture of chosen intimacy that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. "How did it go today?" Sophia asked, helping Elena return the suitcase contents to their honored place. "I told them about breaking cycles," Elena replied. "About choosing to transform pain into purpose instead of passing it on to the next generation." Maya, now 17 and thinking about college, settled beside her great-grandmother. "Are you going to write it all down, the whole story?" Elena smiled, gesturing toward a laptop computer that had been Marcus's gift, his way of supporting her desire to document her experiences for future generations. "I'm writing it for all the children who need to know that abandonment isn't the end of the story, that healing is possible, that sometimes the family that saves you is the one you choose to create." Outside, the spring evening was full of possibility, and Elena Rossi, station child, survivor, grandmother, continued the work of turning wounds into wisdom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.